You're standing in the marble corridors of ancient Rome. The year is 37 AD, and you've just witnessed something that makes your blood run cold. The most powerful man in the world has just declared himself a living god, and the price of admission to his divine presence isn't gold or silver. It's your body, your dignity, your soul. You watch in horror as senators, generals, and nobles who once commanded legions now grovel on their knees, competing for the twisted privilege of serving their emperor's most depraved desires. This isn't just another tale of Roman excess. This is the story of how absolute power transformed a young man into a monster who weaponized sexuality itself, turning the sacred halls of empire into chambers of systematic abuse. The emperor's name was Caligula, and what he did to Rome's elite would make even the most jaded historians recoil in disgust. Before diving into this forgotten chapter of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand how Rome's court became a carnival of sexual exploitation, we must first understand the man who orchestrated this nightmare. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, wasn't born evil. In fact, his early years suggested he might become one of Rome's greatest emperors. Born into the most prestigious family in the empire, he was the great-grandson of Augustus himself, Rome's first emperor. His father, Germanicus, was beloved by the people, a brilliant general who had conquered Germania and earned the fierce loyalty of his soldiers. But tragedy stalked the imperial family like a vengeful god. When Caligula was just 7 years old, his father died under mysterious circumstances. Many suspected poison, whispered that Emperor Tiberius had ordered the murder to eliminate a potential rival. Caligula's mother Agrippina was convinced of this, and her accusations against Tiberius led to her exile and eventual death in prison. One by one, Caligula watched his brothers disappear, arrested, exiled, or driven to suicide by the paranoid emperor who saw threats in every shadow. By age 19, Caligula was the last surviving male heir of his bloodline. Tiberius, perhaps feeling guilty about destroying the boy's family, summoned him to live on the island of Capri. What happened during those 6 years would shape the monster Caligula would become. Capri, under Tiberius, was a place of unspeakable horrors. The aging emperor had retreated there to indulge his darkest appetites, surrounding himself with young boys and girls who served his every twisted desire. Imagine being a teenager, traumatized by the systematic destruction of your family, suddenly thrust into this environment of sexual predation and moral corruption. Caligula learned to survive by becoming whatever Tiberius wanted him to be: compliant, entertaining, willing to participate in acts that would have horrified his murdered father. He perfected the art of reading powerful men's desires and fulfilling them, no matter how degrading. Ancient historians hint at what transpired during those dark years, but even they struggled to describe the full extent of the corruption. Suetonius wrote that Caligula's natural cruelty was already evident, that he delighted in witnessing torture and execution. But what they couldn't capture was the psychological fracturing that occurred as the young prince learned that power meant the ability to force others into submission, that sexuality was a weapon, and that human dignity was a luxury only the powerless believed in. When Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, some whispered that Caligula had smothered him with a pillow. Whether true or not, the 24-year-old who emerged from Capri to claim the imperial throne was fundamentally broken. The Roman people, desperate for relief from Tiberius's paranoid tyranny, welcomed their new emperor with genuine joy. They remembered his beloved father Germanicus and hoped the son would restore honor to the empire. For the first few months, it seemed their prayers had been answered. Caligula recalled political exiles, distributed bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, and sponsored magnificent games for the people. He appeared to be everything Romans had hoped for: young, energetic, generous, connected to the glorious military tradition of his father. But those who looked closely might have noticed something disturbing in his eyes, a coldness that suggested the smiling young emperor was performing a role rather than expressing genuine emotion. The transformation began gradually, almost imperceptibly. It started with small violations of traditional protocol. Caligula insisted that senators approach him with the deference usually reserved for gods. He demanded that his horse Incitatus be treated as a full member of the imperial court, complete with its own palace and servants. These eccentricities were initially dismissed as the harmless quirks of a young ruler finding his footing. But the eccentricities escalated into something far more sinister. Caligula announced that he was no longer merely emperor, but a living god, equal to Jupiter himself. This wasn't just megalomania, it was a calculated strategy to break down every barrier that might limit his power over others. If he was divine, then his desires were sacred commandments. If he was a god, then serving his pleasure became a religious duty. The sexual exploitation began with the imperial court itself. Caligula demanded that the wives and daughters of senators be brought before him for his inspection and pleasure. This wasn't presented as rape, it was framed as divine honor, a sacred privilege that families should be grateful to receive. The psychological manipulation was masterful and terrifying. Powerful men who had commanded armies and governed provinces found themselves pimping their own wives and children to preserve their positions and their lives. Senator Marcus Lepidus watched in silence as his teenage daughter was led away to serve the emperor's pleasure, knowing that any protest would mean death not just for himself, but for his entire family. The girl returned days later, hollow-eyed and broken, but Marcus was expected to smile and thank the emperor for the honor bestowed upon his household. This became the new normal: fathers delivering their daughters, husbands offering their wives, all while maintaining the fiction that they were participating in sacred rituals rather than systematic sexual abuse. The emperor's appetites were not limited to women. Young men from noble families found themselves summoned to private audiences where the line between political discussion and sexual assault dissolved completely. Caligula had learned from Tiberius that power meant the ability to take whatever you wanted from whomever you wanted, and he applied this lesson with methodical precision. What made this system particularly insidious was how it corrupted everyone it touched. The victims became complicit in their own abuse, forced to smile and express gratitude for treatment that violated every principle of human dignity. The perpetrator surrounded himself with people who had been broken by his system, creating a court where moral resistance became literally unthinkable. The emperor's sisters were not exempt from his attentions. Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina found themselves at the center of scandals that shocked even jaded Roman society. Caligula openly declared his intention to marry all three, claiming that gods were not bound by mortal concepts of incest. When Drusilla died young, possibly from the stress of her situation, Caligula had her declared a goddess and established a cult in her honor. But this was only the beginning. What started as the sexual exploitation of the imperial court would soon expand into a systematic program of humiliation designed to break the spirit of Rome's entire ruling class. The boy who had learned to survive through submission on Capri was now teaching the same lessons to everyone around him. The transformation was complete. The hopeful young emperor, who had once brought joy to Roman hearts, had become something else entirely: a predator who had weaponized the very foundations of power itself. The Senate House that had once echoed with the eloquent debates of Cicero and Caesar now became a theater of sexual humiliation, orchestrated by a madman with unlimited power. Caligula understood that true domination required more than just political control. It demanded the complete psychological subjugation of his subjects. And he had discovered the most effective weapon for achieving this: the systematic destruction of sexual dignity. Picture yourself as Senator Gaius Asinius Pollio, a man who had served Rome with distinction for 3 decades. You've commanded legions, governed provinces, accumulated wealth and honor through a lifetime of service to the empire. Now you stand in the imperial palace, watching your 20-year-old son being led away by the emperor's guards, knowing exactly what awaits him behind those gilded doors. Your hands shake with rage, but you force yourself to remain motionless. One wrong move, one flash of defiance, and your entire family will be destroyed. This was the genius of Caligula's system. It didn't just violate individuals, it shattered the bonds that held Roman society together. Fathers could no longer protect their children. Husbands could no longer defend their wives. The most fundamental relationships that defined Roman masculinity and honor were perverted into sources of shame and complicity. The emperor began hosting elaborate dinner parties that were really elaborate sexual auditions. Noble families would arrive dressed in their finest togas, expecting a typical court banquet with political discussions and refined entertainment. Instead, they found themselves trapped in scenarios designed to strip away every pretense of dignity. Caligula would recline on his couch, surveying the assembled guests like a farmer examining livestock, pointing at wives, daughters, and sons with the casual authority of someone selecting fruit at a market. "You," he might say, gesturing at a senator's wife, "join me for a private consultation about your husband's loyalty to the empire." The euphemism fooled no one, but it provided just enough plausible deniability to allow the charade to continue. The woman would be forced to choose between her own violation and her family's destruction, a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. The psychological torture extended beyond the immediate victims. Husbands were forced to watch as their wives were led away, maintaining neutral expressions while their hearts shattered. Children witnessed their parents' humiliation, learning that the most powerful bonds in their world could be severed at the whim of a single man. The emperor sometimes demanded that family members participate in selecting which relative would serve his pleasure, turning love itself into an instrument of betrayal. Marcus Junius Brutus, descendant of Caesar's assassin, found himself in an impossible position when Caligula demanded that he choose between offering his wife or his daughter for the emperor's entertainment. The historical irony was not lost on Caligula, who delighted in forcing the descendant of a tyrant killer to become a pimp for tyranny. Brutus chose his wife, believing he could better protect his innocent daughter. But his wife never forgave him for the choice, and their marriage became a battlefield of guilt, resentment, and mutual blame. The family destroyed itself from within, exactly as Caligula had intended. The emperor's sexual exploitation wasn't random or chaotic. It followed a carefully calculated pattern designed to maximize psychological impact. He targeted the families of potential rivals first, breaking their spirits before they could organize resistance. Military commanders found their sons conscripted into the emperor's personal pleasure corps. Wealthy merchants discovered that their daughter's virginity was now considered imperial property. Religious leaders watched their sacred vows of celibacy become meaningless when the living god demanded their compliance. But perhaps most perversely, Caligula created a twisted hierarchy of privilege within his system of abuse. Victims who pleased him might find their taxes reduced or their family members promoted to prestigious positions. This created a horrifying competitive dynamic where people began trying to excel at their own degradation, hoping that superior performance in humiliation might protect them from even worse fates. Young Marcus Aemilius Scaurus became known throughout the court for his willingness to anticipate and fulfill the emperor's desires before being asked. His family's wealth and status increased dramatically as his personal dignity disappeared. Other noble families began studying his techniques, trying to understand how their own children might better serve the emperor's appetites. The corruption spread like a plague, turning parents into procurers, and children into commodities. The emperor established what he called divine academies, where young nobles were trained in the arts of pleasure. These weren't brothels. They were presented as elite educational institutions, where Rome's future leaders learned to serve their god-emperor. Students studied not just traditional subjects like rhetoric and philosophy, but also more intimate skills designed to satisfy imperial desires. Graduation ceremonies became selection events, where Caligula chose his favorites for permanent positions in his personal household. The academies served multiple purposes beyond mere sexual gratification. They created a generation of Roman elites who had been conditioned from adolescence to view submission to absolute power as normal and necessary. These young men and women would grow up to become senators, generals, and governors who had learned that authority meant the right to take whatever you wanted from those beneath you. The system was designed to perpetuate itself, creating future leaders who would accept and continue the cycle of abuse. Religious ceremonies became particularly twisted showcases for Caligula's sexual theater. During festivals honoring the gods, the emperor would select Vestal virgins and force them to participate in rituals that violated every sacred tradition they had sworn to uphold. The psychological impact was devastating. These women had dedicated their lives to serving the divine, only to discover that their god-emperor's idea of worship involved the destruction of everything they held sacred. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's highest religious authority, was forced to officiate at ceremonies where his own daughter served as a living sacrifice to the emperor's lusts. The ancient rituals that had connected Romans to their gods for centuries became pornographic displays designed to demonstrate that no tradition, no matter how sacred, could limit imperial power. Foreign ambassadors arriving in Rome found themselves witnesses to scenes that challenged their understanding of civilized governance. Egyptian envoys, accustomed to pharaohs who claimed divine status, were nonetheless shocked by the explicit sexual nature of Roman court ceremonies. Germanic chieftains, whose own societies practiced forms of ritual submission, struggled to comprehend a system where sexual humiliation had become the primary currency of political advancement. These diplomatic encounters served Caligula's broader strategy of projecting Roman power through the display of absolute dominance. When foreign rulers saw how completely he had subjugated his own nobility, they understood that resistance was futile. The sexual exploitation of Rome's elite became a form of psychological warfare directed at the entire known world. The emperor's own family members found no sanctuary from his appetites. His surviving sisters lived in constant fear of his sexual demands, never knowing when familial affection might transform into something far darker and more threatening. Palace servants reported hearing screams from the imperial family quarters that suggested even the bonds of blood provided no protection from the god-emperor's desires. The systematic abuse extended far beyond the imperial family into every corner of Roman society that mattered. Caligula understood that true power required the complete restructuring of social relationships, and sexuality became his primary tool for achieving this transformation. He began by targeting the wives of his most trusted advisors, demonstrating that loyalty meant nothing when divine desire was involved. Lucius Vitellius, one of Rome's most experienced generals, arrived at the palace expecting a routine military briefing. Instead, he found his emperor reclining naked on a golden couch, surrounded by the wives and daughters of various senators. Caligula gestured casually toward Vitellius's own wife, who stood trembling among the other women. "Your lovely Antonia has volunteered to demonstrate her devotion to the empire," the emperor announced with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Surely you wouldn't deny her this sacred opportunity to serve her god." Vitellius faced the impossible choice that had become commonplace in Caligula's Rome. Refuse, and watch his entire family be executed for treason against a living deity. Accept, and become complicit in his own wife's violation while maintaining the facade of gratitude. He chose survival, as most did, bowing deeply and expressing his honor at his wife's selection for divine service. But something died in his eyes that day, the same thing that died in the eyes of every man who faced this choice. The emperor's appetite for psychological torment grew more sophisticated with each passing month. He began hosting elaborate games where noble families competed for the privilege of avoiding his attention. Parents were forced to bid against each other, offering increasingly valuable treasures and territories in exchange for their children's safety. The auctions became public spectacles, where Rome's most powerful citizens debased themselves for the entertainment of their god-emperor. Senator Quintus Fabius Maximus found himself bidding his ancestral estates against Senator Marcus Crassus for the right to keep their daughters out of the imperial bedchamber. The bidding escalated until both men had essentially bankrupted themselves, transferring vast wealth to the imperial treasury in exchange for a promise that might be broken at any moment. Caligula watched these proceedings with obvious delight, understanding that he was simultaneously enriching himself while destroying the economic power base of potential rivals. But the true genius of the system lay in how it corrupted the victims themselves. Young nobles who survived their time in the imperial household often emerged as enthusiastic supporters of the regime that had abused them. They had learned to find identity and purpose in their degradation, convincing themselves that serving the emperor's pleasure was indeed a form of religious devotion. These broken individuals became Caligula's most effective agents, using their own trauma to normalize the abuse of others. Marcus Salvius Otho, barely 18 when he was first summoned to serve the emperor's desires, eventually became one of Caligula's most trusted courtiers. He developed an uncanny ability to identify which senators' children would make suitable additions to the imperial pleasure corps, using his own experience of violation to evaluate others' potential for submission. His recommendations were rarely wrong, and his success in procuring fresh victims for the emperor earned him substantial rewards and political advancement. The transformation of Rome's youth was perhaps the most insidious aspect of Caligula's reign. An entire generation was growing up believing that sexual submission to authority was not just normal, but sacred. These young people would eventually inherit positions of power throughout the empire, carrying with them the psychological conditioning that had shaped their formative years. They would govern provinces, command legions, and make decisions affecting millions of lives, all while believing that absolute power naturally included absolute sexual access to subordinates. The emperor established what he called sacred brothels throughout Rome, staffed by the sons and daughters of noble families who had displeased him in some way. These weren't common prostitutes serving paying customers. They were aristocratic young people forced to service anyone the emperor designated, from foreign diplomats to common soldiers he wished to reward. The psychological impact on these victims was devastating, but equally important was the message sent to their families and social circles. No one, regardless of birth or status, was beyond the reach of imperial sexual authority. Julia Agrippina, daughter of a respected senator, found herself assigned to one of these establishments after her father questioned a minor tax policy in the Senate. She was forced to service Germanic tribesmen, Egyptian merchants, and Gallic chieftains, anyone Caligula deemed worthy of sampling Roman nobility. Her education in Greek philosophy and Latin literature became irrelevant. Her value now lay entirely in her ability to satisfy the sexual appetites of men she would previously have considered beneath her notice. The emperor's sexual theater extended into the gladiatorial arena, where he forced noble prisoners to fight naked before being claimed as prizes by whoever pleased him most. The traditional Roman virtue of dying with dignity in the arena was perverted into a spectacle of sexual humiliation. Defeated gladiators, who might once have earned honor through brave death, were instead dragged off to serve the lusts of their social superiors, their courage transformed into just another form of entertainment for the imperial court. Religious festivals became particularly twisted celebrations of sexual dominance. During the Feast of Bacchus, traditionally a time of controlled revelry and wine drinking, Caligula mandated that all participants must offer their bodies to whoever the emperor designated. The ancient ritual that had once celebrated fertility and abundance became a nightmare of forced coupling and public violation. Priests, who had dedicated their lives to serving the gods, found themselves forced to watch their sacred ceremonies transformed into pornographic displays. The corruption spread beyond Rome itself, as provincial governors, desperate to maintain their positions, began implementing similar systems throughout the empire. Gaul, Britain, and Syria all reported instances of Roman officials demanding sexual tribute from local populations, claiming they were following imperial precedent. The abuse that had begun in the marble corridors of the palace was metastasizing throughout the known world, carried by administrators who had learned that sexual exploitation was not just acceptable, but expected. In Alexandria, the Roman prefect established a system where Egyptian nobles could purchase tax exemptions by offering their children for imperial service. The arrangement was presented as voluntary, but everyone understood the consequences of refusal. Ancient Egyptian families that had maintained their dignity through centuries of foreign occupation found themselves forced to choose between financial ruin and the sexual enslavement of their offspring. The British chieftains who had submitted to Roman rule after decades of warfare discovered that surrender meant more than just political subjugation. Roman commanders began demanding tribute in the form of young warriors and maidens, claiming these were gifts for the divine emperor in Rome. Entire tribes found themselves breeding children specifically for export to satisfy imperial appetites, their ancient traditions of honor and courage reduced to the production of sexual commodities. Even the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor with their lives, found their loyalty tested in ways they had never imagined. Caligula began demanding that his bodyguards offer their wives and daughters as proof of their dedication to his divine person. The soldiers who formed the backbone of imperial security discovered that their oath of service extended far beyond military duty into the most intimate aspects of their family lives. Centurion Gaius Scribonius Curio had served Rome for 20 years, fighting Ignia, earning honors in Germania and Britain for bravery and loyalty. Now he stood at attention while his 15-year-old daughter was led away to join the emperor's personal household. His fellow soldiers watched in silence, each understanding that they might face the same choice tomorrow. The military discipline that had built the Roman Empire was being turned against itself, forcing soldiers to sacrifice their families to preserve their positions. The emperor's sexual exploitation created a parallel economy within the empire, where political advancement, military promotion, and commercial success all depended on one's willingness to participate in the system of abuse. Merchants discovered that lucrative government contracts required offering their children as collateral. Military commanders found that promotions came with expectations about sharing their wives. Even slaves learned that their master's favor could be earned through facilitating access to other slaves' bodies. Caligula's reign of sexual terror lasted only 4 years, but its impact echoed through history as a cautionary tale about the corruption of absolute power. In 41 AD, his own Praetorian Guard finally ended the nightmare, stabbing him to death in a palace corridor. But the damage was done. An entire generation of Romans had learned that human dignity was negotiable, that family bonds could be severed by imperial whim, and that survival required complicity in unspeakable acts. The young man who had once inspired hope became history's most twisted example of how trauma can transform victims into monsters. Caligula's story reminds us that when we grant unlimited power to any individual, we risk unleashing horrors that can destroy the very foundations of civilization itself.